The particular quality of a Tuesday afternoon in Hollywood in March of 1961 was that it felt like a day the city had not quite decided to take seriously. A day that existed in the gap between the weekends when things happen and the Mondays when the consequences of those things were processed. And Frank Sinatra sat in the corner booth of a diner called the Formosa Café on Santa Monica Boulevard that he had been coming to since 1948. And that had the specific virtue of being a place where the other customers were either too absorbed in their own conversations or too accustomed to the presence of famous people to make the presence of a famous person into an occasion. And Frank Sinatra was eating a late lunch alone because his afternoon had cleared unexpectedly when a meeting with a film producer had been postponed, and he was reading a trade publication with the half attention of someone who is maintaining the appearance of being occupied rather than actually being occupied. And his real attention was on the conversation happening in the booth directly behind him, which he was not trying to hear, but which was being conducted at a volume that made not hearing it an active rather than passive condition. The two people in the booth behind Frank Sinatra were a man and a woman who appeared from what Frank Sinatra could observe from his peripheral vision to be in their 50s. And the woman was doing most of the talking, and the man was doing most of the listening. And what the woman was talking about was a situation involving her nephew, a young man whose name Frank Sinatra gathered was Paul and who was a musician, a guitarist, and who had been offered a position playing with a touring show that was going to be going through California and Nevada over the next 3 months. And the position was the kind of opportunity that a young musician in Paul's position did not easily come by, and that could be the beginning of a professional life if handled correctly. But Paul had a problem, the problem being that the guitar he owned was not adequate for the professional context he was being asked to enter. Was a decent instrument for a young musician still developing, but not the instrument that a professional touring show would expect its players to bring to the stage. And Paul knew this and had told his aunt, the woman in the booth, and the aunt had been trying to figure out how to close the gap between the guitar Paul had and the guitar Paul needed, and the gap was financial. And the financial gap was not enormous in the context of a conversation about musical instruments, but was enormous in the context of what Paul and his family could access. And the woman was explaining all of this to the man in the booth, who was apparently her husband, with the specific mixture of pride in her nephew's opportunity and distress at the obstacle standing between Paul and that opportunity that people carried when they could see clearly both what was possible and what was preventing it. Frank Sinatra listened to the first 3 minutes of this conversation without intending to, and then listened to the next 5 minutes with the specific quality of attention that he brought to things that had begun to matter to him. And what had made the conversation matter was not the story itself, which was a story of the kind that played out constantly in the lives of people trying to make careers in music, but was the specific quality of the woman's voice when she talked about Paul. The quality of someone who had watched a young person work hard at something and develop real ability, and who could not accept that a gap in financial resources was going to be the thing that prevented the ability from finding its proper expression. Frank Sinatra put down his trade publication and thought about the conversation for a moment, and then did something that he occasionally did when a situation presented itself clearly enough that doing nothing felt like a deliberate choice rather than an absence of choice, which was that he acted on it. He called his waiter over and asked for a piece of paper and a pen, and when the waiter brought them, Frank Sinatra wrote a name and a telephone number on the paper, the name being that of a music store owner on Cayuga Boulevard named Gerald Park, who Frank Sinatra had known for 15 years, and who sold and serviced instruments for session musicians, and who Frank Sinatra had done sufficient business with over those 15 years to have established the kind of professional relationship that made certain conversations straightforward. And Frank Sinatra folded the paper and then turned in his booth and said "excuse me" to the woman and the man behind him. And both of them turned to look at him with the expression that people had when Frank Sinatra appeared in their immediate vicinity without warning. And Frank Sinatra said, "I wasn't trying to listen, but your booth is close, and I heard some of what you said about your nephew." And the woman looked at him with an expression that contained several things at once: the recognition of who was speaking to her, and the slight embarrassment of knowing that a private conversation had been overheard, and the particular alertness of someone who senses that something unexpected is about to happen, but cannot yet determine whether the unexpected thing is welcome. And Frank Sinatra said, "Write down your nephew's name and tell him to go to this address tomorrow morning and ask for Gerald and tell Gerald that Frank sent him and Gerald will sort out the instrument." And he held out the paper with Gerald's name and number, and the woman looked at it and then looked at Frank Sinatra and said, "I can't accept this." And Frank Sinatra said, "You're not accepting anything. Your nephew is going on a professional tour, and he needs a professional instrument. Gerald will find him the right one and will figure out the arrangement." And the woman said, "What does figure out the arrangement mean?" And Frank Sinatra said, "It means Paul pays what he can pay and Gerald and I work out the rest. And Paul doesn't need to know the specifics of that because the specifics are between me and Gerald." And the woman looked at him for another moment and then said, "Why would you do this for someone you've never met?" And Frank Sinatra said, "Because you love your nephew enough to sit in a diner on a Tuesday talking about his problem with your husband, and that kind of love deserves to find a solution," which was not the kind of thing Frank Sinatra typically said out loud, but which was what he was thinking. And the woman took the paper. The call Frank Sinatra made to Gerald Park happened from the Formosa Café's telephone at the back of the restaurant, and Gerald answered on the third ring, and Frank Sinatra explained the situation in the direct manner he used with people he knew well enough to skip the preamble, told Gerald that a young guitarist named Paul would be coming in the following morning, and that Paul needed a professional-grade instrument for a touring show, and that Frank Sinatra would cover whatever gap existed between what Paul could pay and what the instrument cost. And Gerald said, "How much gap are we talking about?" And Frank Sinatra said, "I don't know yet. Use your judgment about the right instrument and let Paul pay what he can pay and send me the difference." And Gerald said, "Does Paul know you're doing this?" And Frank Sinatra said, "No, and I'd like it to stay that way if possible. Tell him it's a store credit or a payment plan or whatever makes professional sense." And Gerald said, "I can work something out." And Frank Sinatra said, "Good," and hung up and went back to his booth and finished his lunch. Paul arrived at Gerald Park's music store the following morning with his aunt's handwritten note and asked for Gerald. And Gerald spent an hour with Paul going through instruments and asking Paul the specific questions that a good instrument dealer asked about the kind of work a musician was going to be doing and the sound they were trying to produce and the venues they would be playing. And Paul answered each question with the careful precision of someone who had been thinking seriously about his own playing for long enough to have developed specific ideas about what he needed rather than simply a general desire for better equipment. And Gerald found Paul's responses more sophisticated than he had expected and selected 3 instruments for Paul to play. And when Paul played the third one, there was a quality of rightness to it that both of them recognized without needing to discuss it. The specific alignment between an instrument and the person playing it that happened occasionally and could not be manufactured. And Gerald told Paul the price and Paul said he could pay part of it now and the rest over time, and Gerald said that would work fine and arranged a payment plan that represented exactly what Paul could manage. And the conversation ended there without Paul knowing anything about the telephone call or the arrangement between Gerald and Frank Sinatra. The touring show that Paul joined in April of 1961 ran through California and Nevada through June and was the beginning of a professional career that Paul built over the following 2 decades working as a session guitarist in Los Angeles. And the guitar he had purchased from Gerald Park's store remained his primary instrument for 11 years, until he could afford to replace it with something better. And Paul told the story of the guitar in an interview with a musician's trade publication in 1979, when the interviewer asked about the instruments that had mattered in his career. And Paul said that the most important guitar he had ever owned was the one he had purchased at a store on Cayuga Boulevard before his first touring gig, that the store had worked out a payment plan that was more generous than he had any right to expect, and that the guitar had lasted him through a decade of professional work and had been present for recordings that he still considered among the best things he had done. And when the interviewer asked about the store and whether Paul had maintained the relationship, Paul said that the store had eventually closed and that the owner had retired and that Paul had tried to go back and thank him properly but had never been able to make contact. And Paul said that this was one of the things he thought about occasionally. The kindness of a stranger who had made an unusually generous payment plan available to a young guitarist who had nothing to offer in return except the intention to pay what he owed, which he had done. Frank Sinatra was in Las Vegas when Paul's interview appeared and did not see it until a musician friend clipped it and sent it to Frank Sinatra's management office with a note that said you might find this interesting. And Frank Sinatra read it in his suite at the Sands and sat with it for a while in the particular way he sat with things that were satisfying in the specific sense of things that had worked out the way they were supposed to work out. And then he folded it and put it in the drawer where he kept other such things, and went on with his evening, which involved a rehearsal with his band, and then dinner with 2 friends, and then a walk through the casino that he took some evenings when the energy of the casino floor was preferable to the quiet of the suite. And the walk took him past the card tables and the slot machines and the specific human theater of a casino in full operation. People trying their luck and sometimes winning, and more often not winning and returning regardless, because the possibility was real enough to justify the attempt. And Frank Sinatra walked through it with his hands in his pockets and his mind on nothing in particular, which was the state he sometimes reached when something that had been requiring a portion of his attention had been resolved, and the portion had been freed up, and had not yet found something else to occupy it. And the Sands at night in the spring of its particular year contained him as it contained everything else that moved through it, temporarily and without record. And the guitarist in Lowe's Angels did not know, and would never know, who had made the phone call from the back of a diner on Santa Monica Boulevard. And the woman who had been talking about her nephew in the next booth did not know for certain, though she suspected. And the suspicion had been enough for her to keep the folded piece of paper with Gerald's name and number for the rest of her life, not as evidence of anything, but as a reminder that the people in the next booth were sometimes paying more attention than you thought.